Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. I hope you are doing well. In this video, we are going to go over World War I, which took place between 1914 through 1918. We are going to go over the overall and underlying causes of World War I and why the U.S. entered World War I. So needless to say, World War I was a true world war, but the APUSH curriculum will have us focusing mostly on the perspective of the United States in terms of political, cultural, and societal effects of the war. The situation in Europe immediately prior to World War I was a delicate but toxic balance of structural forces and alliances, which were ultimately ignited by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. The stage was now set for an inevitable war. World War I also was known as the Great War. As you probably know, MAIN is an often used acronym to analyze the war. M stood for militarism, A stood for alliances, I stood for imperialism, and N stood for nationalism. First, militarism. The 19th century was an era of military competition in Europe. The policy of building a stronger military was relative to your neighbors, so there ended up becoming an arms race. And this ultimately created a paranoia. And in the spirit of militarism, many thought that war was actually a good thing to assert your place in the world. The British had naval superiority, but the Germans were looking to expand their navy. European governments often exaggerated their military expansion, adding to this arms race paranoia. Alliances were very important to World War I. A web of alliances developed in Europe between 1870 and 1914, effectively creating two camps within Europe that were dedicated to each other and committed to protecting each other. In 1880, the Triple Alliance was formed. This is also known as the Central Powers during World War I. This was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. In response, in 1907, the Triple Entente, this is known as the Allied Powers in World War I, was formed by France, Britain, and Russia. There ended up being many other additional secret alliances too. The mindset that a strike versus one was a strike versus all in these European alliances created for a very volatile situation that would promise to escalate any conflict. Imperialism. Imperial competition in Europe around the world was flourishing and brought together countries and started conflicts that otherwise probably never would have started. Fired by the rise of industrialism and the pursuit of new markets and looking for spheres of influence, imperialism was at its highest point in world history in the early 1900s. Nationalism. Nationalism was a new and powerful source of tension in Europe. It created new areas of interest in which European countries could compete. Also, the amount of pride that countries had in themselves grew during this time, and the "we are better than them" mentality was very pervasive. The stage was set for a war, and the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand ignited it. The First World War ended up being the most deadly war in the history of the world up to that point. So as you can see here, this is a map of Europe and its military alliances in 1914 at the beginning of World War I. You can see the Triple Entente, or the Allied powers. France, Great Britain, and Russia were the main players. They are in green here, as you can see. The Triple Alliance, which was also known as the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. They are in this reddish-orange. And then the neutral countries, the ones that attempted to stay out of World War I, they are in yellow. So Spain, Norway, Sweden, and other neutral areas. And then, of course, the ultimate neutral power, that would be Switzerland right there in the middle. So why did the U.S. end up entering World War I? It should be noted that a great number of Americans had emotional ties to both sides of the warring powers. At the time, a third of America's population were first or second generation born immigrants. Many Americans felt an affinity for Great Britain because of the longstanding cultural connections. Most German Americans sided with their fatherland. There was a lot of discrimination towards German Americans for this during the war, which we'll talk about later. At first, the U.S. wisely chose to stay out of the war, but maintaining a neutral stance during a world war was not a very easy thing at all. Eventually, the U.S. would join the Allied forces and officially entered the war, which ended up becoming the major turning point in the war. So now let's go through the steps and the items that eventually would lead to the United States entering World War I. A big factor for the U.S. entering World War I was the strong pro-British sentiment and close economic ties. When the war began, American trade with the Central Powers basically stopped, while trade with the Allied powers had gone up 400%. Wilson allowed Wall Street banks to lend the Allied powers money they needed to continue purchasing American products. As you can imagine, this meant that the United States was banking on an Allied powers victory. Another reason the United States joined the war was because of the strong anti-German sentiments in the United States. Wilson and most Americans favored the British and French side, as many Americans were sympathetic towards the democratic governments of these countries. Many Americans did not like Kaiser Wilhelm, who was the German autocrat. With the help of the British, American newspapers were well supplied with stories of German soldiers committing atrocities in German-controlled France and Belgium, and U.S. newspapers really publicized these happenings. After the war began, as you can see in this government poster advertising for Liberty bonds over here to the right, the U.S. government used overtly anti-German propaganda as it depicts a Hun, a slur for a German soldier, with bloody hands and a bayonet. This all contributed to strong anti-German sentiments in the United States. The sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat in 1915 was a big cause of the United States entering the war, although the United States did not enter until about 2 years later. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship that was also carrying munitions. The Germans had printed notices warning passengers against traveling on the Lusitania. However, this did not matter to the American public. Americans were horrified by the 1,200 men, women, and children killed, 128 of them being American. Wilson lodged a strong diplomatic attempt to resist calls for war, but the sinking of the Lusitania did not help his cause. After a couple of other ships were sunk, the German government was anxious to avoid American entrance into the war at this point. The Germans issued what became known as the Sussex Pledge, declaring that they would not sink any more ships without specific warning. For a while, it looked like President Wilson had secured peace. This is when the slogan, "He kept us out of war," enabled Wilson to win re-election. While still wanting to stay out of war, Wilson asked Congress to get the military into a state of preparedness. In January of 1917, the Germans announced they would no longer recognize the Sussex Pledge and would participate in what became known as unrestricted submarine warfare in an attempt to finish the war. This meant that any ship carrying supplies to the Allies were fair game, even if they were flying a neutral flag. The Germans realized this would probably make the United States want to enter the war, but they thought they could beat the British, French, and Russians before that could happen. So this was quite a calculated attempt by the Central Powers to finish off the war. The Zimmerman Note, or the Zimmerman Telegram, was seen as an instigation for the United States to join the war against Germany. As war loomed between the United States and Germany, Arthur Zimmerman, a German minister, foolishly sent an inflammatory diplomatic note to the Mexican government. In the note, Zimmerman encouraged Mexicans to attack the U.S. and promised German support and would give back the Mexican territories that the Mexicans gave to the United States following the Mexican-American War. The U.S. officially enters World War I. On April 2nd, President Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and told them that the U.S. had to declare war. Wilson famously stated, "The world must be made safe for democracy," as a rationale for the U.S. entering the war. In April of 1917, the United States entered World War I by Congress declaring war on Germany and its allies. Despite adamantly trying to keep the U.S. out of war, when the U.S. finally did join the war, Woodrow Wilson looked forward to helping the Allied powers and being part of the eventual peace process once the United States side had won.